everyone, welcome to my channel Notes in the Sewing Room. My name's Becky. Thank you for joining me today. Today's video is all about how to make your very own DIY skirt at home. This is a project that's suitable for beginners, but it's also suitable for those people who are more experienced at sewing as well. If you are new to my channel is all about sewing and a few other craft activities as well. So if that's something that does interest you, I would love it if you could consider subscribing to my channel and to hit that like button if you do like what you see today. It would also be fantastic if you'd like to leave me any comments below about any questions that you've got, or perhaps if you want to let me know what you're working on this week. Before I get started and tell you what you need for this project, I'll just tell you about what I'm wearing for those of you who are interested. I know some of you sometimes ask. So today I'm wearing my Friday Pattern Company square neck top, which is made in a knit fabric, and I'm also wearing a homemade denim skirt, which is a hack of the Sewaholic Canby dress pattern, and obviously I've turned it into a skirt. And if you are a regular viewer, you'll notice that I've had my hair done, which is amazing, and I couldn't wait to go to the hairdressers, and I'm so pleased that I've actually had my colour done and I'm feeling all nice and fresh. It's amazing what a trip to the hairdressers can do for you. Anyway, what do we need for this project? I've been really excited about sharing this project with you. I was inspired to make this skirt by watching the Great British Sewing Bee from kind of like Christmas time, the specials that run at Christmas, New Year, something like that. But don't worry, if you didn't see those episodes, you really don't need to. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but that's where I was inspired by, basically. So on those episodes, or on one of the episodes, they made a lovely gathered waist skirt using some really pretty elastic. So I thought, right, I've got to have a go at that. So I went onto Etsy and I managed to find some really pretty elastic. So this is the elastic that I've got here. As you can see, it's glittery and it's really stretchy, and that is going to form my waistband. I'm also using some beautiful viscose fabric. I got this from Sew Hayley Jane from a box that I was subscribing to, and it's a really pretty fabric. It's got quite a lot of drape to it. If you can see that there, it's kind of white on one side, and then it's got these beautiful blue spots on it on that side. So as you can see, it's got lots and lots of drape, which is going to work perfectly for this project. You don't have to use a viscose though. You could use, you know, any other kind of fabric that you've got at home, but I would recommend something that's got a little bit of drape to it, as I think it's going to make the skirt seem a little bit more swishy in the end, if that's the kind of look that you're going for. As well as those things, you're also going to need some scissors. So you're going to need dressmaking scissors of some sort to cut out your fabric. You're also going to need a tape measure. We are not using a pattern for this project at all, so I'm going to show you how to actually draw out the measurements on here. It's really simple. So so just a regular tape measure. You're also going to need some thread. So I'm using a blue thread, just a regular kind of moon cotton thread, to sew up the skirt part. And then I've also got this Gutterman thread, which is in a bright silver colour, which I'm going to be using when I'm sewing onto the waistband. Depending on how you want to do this, I'm actually going to top stitch, so you will see my stitching on my waistband. So that is something to keep in mind if you are thinking about what threads to use and what you might have in your stash already, or what you might need to buy. I've got a silver waistband, so I went for a silver thread. Apart from that, you're going to need a sewing machine, and I'm going to be also using my overlocker to finish off any edges, but you really don't need to do that. You can of course do that on your sewing machine instead. I think this is going to be the perfect project to add into my spring capsule wardrobe. I did film a video last week, which you can find on my channel, and I'll also link it below for those of you who are interested in watching about planning out my spring capsule wardrobe. So this is one element of that capsule that I'm putting together, and I think it's going to work perfectly with a few other things that I'm going to be making. So let me tell you how to go about doing this project. The first thing we're going to be doing is taking our elastic and measuring it around our waist. So the thing that you want to actually do is you want to measure this so it's at the place that it's going to be sitting on your actual waist, and bearing in mind that this has got stretch to it, so you don't want it to be too loose. If anything, you might want it a little bit more fitted, because obviously it has got that stretch in there as well. Rather than using my tape measure for this, I'm actually just going to measure my elastic around my waist. I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So I want my elastic to actually sit on my high waist there. So that is, as you can see, I've got a long tail here on the elastic. So I'm going to actually just mark that there with a pencil. So I'm going to take a regular pencil to do that. And I'm just going to place a little mark on there. Now, before I actually cut off the tail of my elastic, I'm actually going to tack this on my sewing machine. I'm once again going to test the measurement of my elastic around my waist just to make sure that I'm happy with it. And if I am, I'm then going to use a zigzag stitch on my sewing machine to actually sew up the waistband. Obviously, it's going to need to be a stretchy stitch that you use, so whether that's a zigzag stitch, a lightning bolt stitch, any kind of stretch stitch that you've got on your sewing machine that's your preferred method of sewing stretch fabrics and elastic and that kind of thing will be absolutely fine. But I'm going to baste it first, check the measurement, and then I shall sew it properly with the zigzag after that. So I have lined up my elastic right sides together. So I'm literally going to be sewing down that line there with the basting stitch and then testing it around my waist again just to make sure that it's a good fit. I'm actually just using a white thread to do this on my machine for now. Now, I should have said, rather than using the regular basting stitch that you use on your sewing machine, I've actually just used a very large zigzag stitch on my machine instead to do that basting. That's basically so that I can unpick it very easily if I need to afterwards. So as you can see, I've got my waistband on inside out at the moment. So I've got the white side facing outwards rather than the sparkly side. This is where I'd like my waistband to sit on my actual waist. So I'm happy with that. So I've got my basting stitch just down here. So the next thing I'm going to do is cut off the tail to my elastic there. That can come in for something else, another project. And I'm actually going to then use my normal size zigzag stitch, so whichever you prefer on your machine, to actually sew down that line now. So that's going to be, my proper stitch that is going to be there during the time that I'm, wearing my skirt. So I've actually pulled out the basting stitches that I put in there, and I've now added in 2 pins on here just so that I know where I need to actually sew and that my elastic is completely aligned at the top and at the bottom. Probably seems like a silly thing, but it's worth making sure that your elastic is lined up correctly. So I'll just come in a bit closer so you can see this. So I've got my 2 pins in there. I know where I've got to sew. I've got actually a mark here to show me where I need to sew. So I'll just pop that onto the front there as well so I know exactly. And I'm going to zigzag stitch all the way down that line just there. Then I'll be cutting off the tail as well, and I can use that for another project. So I've now actually zigzagged on here, so you probably can't see very well actually on the camera there, but I've zigzag stitched all the way down there. So I'm now going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut my tail off, because I don't need that anymore. Okay, so that's all gone. So as you can see, I've now got a circle of elastic. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually use my silver thread to actually do a small zigzag stitch just along the top here and along the bottom, just to hold that seam in place so that it doesn't become a little bit more complicated when we're doing the gathering into the waistband. So I've now actually used my silver thread as my top stitch thread just to sew a small line across the top there and a small line across the bottom. And I've actually used white thread in the under part of my machine. I've not bothered to actually finish off the edges of the elastic there because it's elastic, it's actually not going to fray at all. So you can just, leave that as it is really. But that means that seam now is nice and flat so that when we actually gather into that seam, it's not going to be a problem. So that's what it looks like from the outside. And that's what it looks like from the inside, but no one's going to see that apart from you anyway. So the next thing we're going to do is actually measure out our fabric. At this point, you're going to need your scissors and your tape measure, some kind of pencil or tailor's chalk, anything you'd like to use to mark your measurements onto your fabric. So the next thing we're going to be doing is actually cutting out the fabric. So I'm using fabric that's 56 inches wide here. Really, it doesn't really matter how wide the fabric is necessarily. It just depends on how much gather you actually want in your skirt. So my waist actually measures at 28 inches. So because I'm using 56 inches worth of fabric here, I'm going to end up with quite a gathered skirt at the end. but it really depends on how gathered or not you would like your skirt project to actually be in terms of how wide your fabric needs to be. I would recommend going for a fabric that is 56 inches wide or maybe 60 inches wide for this project, rather than something that's slightly narrower, because I think if you did go for more of a narrow fabric, you're not going to get the look that I think we're going for here. So all I'm going to do is measure a straight line across my fabric, and then I'm going to be measuring 23 inches downwards. That's the measurement that I've decided I would like the length of my skirt to be, but obviously you could make yours shorter, you could make it longer, just depends on what actually you like in terms of your skirt, to be honest. And then that panel will be gathered into our waistband. So now I'm going to measure out my fabric. I'll just scan my camera down so you can see me doing that, and then afterwards we're going to be gathering that into the waistband. So you will be cutting your panel on the fold. So this is the fold of my fabric just down the side here. I'm using some pattern weights just to hold my fabric in place, which I think is a really good idea, particularly if you are using something that's a little bit slippery. So you are going to need either a pencil, just a regular pencil, a pen, or some tailor's chalk of some sort. I'm actually using children's chalk here. I find that that's quite good, to be honest. And it saves me investing in something that's slightly more expensive. So as I said, you don't really need to worry about the width going across this way for your project, as long as you're happy with the amount of gather that you're actually going to get. But you do need to think about where you're actually starting your 23 inches from. So I'm going to start mine from around about here, so I'm just going to make a mark there. You don't need to be too precise. Then I'm going to take my tape measure and measure 23 inches down from the mark that I've created. So 23 inches for me just comes to around about here, so I'm just going to make a mark. And then I'll move over to the other side of my fabric. I'll measure across there just to make sure I'm in the right place. I will make a mark just here. So that's basically to line up the mark that we made on the other side. And then I'm going to measure from that mark 23 inches downwards again, which comes to just there. And you just want to make sure that your two marks that you've made, one here and one here, are in the same place, which they are. So I'm just going to add another mark into the centre here. Then I'm going to draw a straight line all the way across from the fold of the fabric all the way across to the other side. You might decide to use a regular ruler to do this, or some other kind of special sewing equipment that you've got, but I've just got a ruler here. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect because we are going to be finishing off the seam of the skirt at the end anyway, of the hem of the skirt, should I say. Okay, and then we're just going to repeat that drawing of the straight line for the top of the skirt as well. Okay, so the next thing to do is to cut out our panel. We should now have one long piece of fabric that looks just like this. So basically one long rectangle of fabric. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually finish off all of the edges of the fabric. So that's both the short ends and the long ends of the fabric. And then after that, we basically need to work out which is the top side of our fabric. So which bit you want to be gathered, I guess, right at the top into the waistband. And when we've done that, so this is after we've overlocked or we've finished off the edges on your sewing machine, whichever you prefer. I'm going to be using my overlocker in just a second. But when we've done that, the next step will be to find our halfway point on our fabric, and then also our quarter points by halving the fabric again. And we'll mark that with a pin or some chalk, something like that, just whichever you fancy. The reason that we're going to be finding the halfway and the quarter points is to basically mark the points in which we're going to be sewing some gathering stitches between. So, right, so first of all, I'm going to be doing my overlocking, and then I'll be back with you. So that's all of my edges overlocked. So the next thing we want to do is actually to find our halfway and our quarter point marks on our fabric. So with my fabric, I've not got a particularly directional print, so it doesn't really matter which is going to be the top and which is going to be the bottom of my skirt, but obviously it depends what fabric you're using. So what we're going to do is we're going to take both short edges here and fold them in together to get our first point mark. So that makes the fabric in half, as you can see there. And I'm just going to put a pin in at that halfway point. That's actually on the fold of the fabric at the moment. So I've just got that just in there, as you can see. And then I am going to then find my quarter point marks by just folding the fabric again. So I've got two different points that I need to mark here. This is just really approximately. You don't need to be too precise, but it just means that we're not sewing one very, very long line of gathering stitches. I found in the past that if you sew two long pieces of gathering stitches together, then actually they can sometimes snap. So, okay, so now we've got our quarter point marks and our halfway point marks as well. The next thing I'm going to do now is move back onto my sewing machine, and between each of the points that we've marked, so between the edge of the fabric and my first pointer, between that point and the next one, etc., I'm going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches. So you can do those whichever length you prefer, but yes, I'm going to be sewing the different lines of gathering stitches, and then I'll be back with you. As I just mentioned in the previous clip, I prefer sewing my gathering stitches in small stages like this rather than doing one continuous line, because I have found in the past that sometimes the thread can snap a little bit and it can be a little bit annoying, and then you have to go back and do your gathering rows again. So this is my preferred method, but obviously you can do your own thing if you prefer. I'm at my sewing machine now and I'm going to be sewing in those gathering stitches that I mentioned. I try and sew my gathering stitches as close to the top of the fabric as I possibly can. Obviously you don't want it to be right on the edge, but you want it to be fairly close so that it's actually enclosed within the seam allowance ideally. Although of course you can just pull out your gathering stitches at the end if you want to. I've now got all of my gathering stitches sewn into my skirt, so you probably can't see very well, but I've sewn the gathering stitches between each of the different points that we were talking about before. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually pull on the ends of my threads to actually make those sections gathered basically. So I'm going to do this kind of roughly at the moment. I'm going to gather each of the different sections that I've got here, and then I'm going to be sewing together the back section of my skirt. The reason I'm going to do that is I'm then going to be able to move on after that to gathering the skirt into my waistband that I previously made. So I don't want to gather the skirt exactly at the moment because I've not sewn together the back edge, but I just thought I'll gather the skirt roughly to begin with, and then we can kind of see a bit easier where the gathers are and we can play around with them to actually get it to match properly into the waistband. So now we've sewn our back seam together, the next thing we need to do is iron that seam open. So basically we just want the inside of the skirt seam just to be ironed all the way open, just like that. So I'm just at my ironing board now and I'm going to get that done. So you may decide to give your skirt a bit more of a press all the way around as well when you are at the ironing board, because of course when you are working and handling the fabric it can get a little bit creased. I know mine has, so I have just given it a little bit of a press, but obviously that's up to you. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is actually gathering this now into my elastic waistband. So I'm just going to show you how to do that, but basically we're going to be joining the two pieces. Okay, so what we want to do now is get the skirt so it's right side facing outwards towards you, and we want to find our back seam, so the seam that you just ironed open, and then we're going to align that with the back seam of your elastic. So we're actually going to be slotting the skirt directly just inside the elastic waistband. So I'm just going to show you how to do that, but ideally, as I said, we need to align those two seams. So the next thing to do is actually just to slot your waistband over the top of your skirt. So the silver side out on mine, my elastic is the outside of my elastic, and the white side is the inside of my elastic. So obviously I've got the silver side facing out, and I've got the skirt, so it's actually the right side of the skirt is facing the wrong side of the elastic, if that makes sense. So obviously we've done our gathering stitches already, but what we need to do now is kind of ease it into the waistband. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I have lined up my back seam of my skirt and the back seam of my elastic, and I've just added a pin in there. I'm going to be pinning my skirt on the outside of the elastic. The reason being that I'm going to be using a top stitching thread on the top of my machine and a different colour thread on the bottom of my machine. So I am planning on sewing this from the outside of the skirt rather than the inside, and that's why I've put my pins there. I'm pinning the skirt in place on the elastic roughly 1.5 centimetres from the bottom of the elastic, but obviously the length or the height that you want to slot in your skirt onto your elastic is entirely up to you. That's just what I'm doing. I've now gathered my skirt into my waistband, so I'm just going to hold this up so that you can see it. Now you do have to kind of pull on those threads a little bit here and there to try and get your skirt to actually fit into your waistband. And then when you've done that, you can trim off any excess threads if you want to, if you are happy with the way that the gathers are sitting within your waistband. So I'm just going to hold mine up so you can see it at the moment. So as you can see, that is my waistband. I've got my pins all along this bottom edge here on the outside of the fabric, and that's the same all the way around. I've tried to make sure that my gathering is roughly equal the whole way around the skirt. And the next thing I'm going to do is move on to my sewing machine. I'm going to be using my silver top stitching thread on the top of my machine, and I'm just going to use a plain blue on the bottom of my machine in my bobbin. So that's the next step, and then we're almost there to having our own DIY skirt. So I've got my top stitching thread on the top of my sewing machine. I've decided to use a very narrow zigzag stitch on my sewing machine, but obviously you could use whichever one you wanted. And then in the bottom of my sewing machine, I have just got my regular thread. I'm starting to sew from the back seam, and then I'm going to work my way all the way around the skirt. So I've now added in 2 rows of stitches along my waistband to gather that into my skirt. So I'm quite happy with how that's come out. So you probably can't see my stitches very well because I have used a silver thread, but I have got 2 rows of stitches running, one directly along the bottom of the waistband and then one slightly further up. But I'm pleased with how that's worked out. So all you need to do now is just have a pull on that elastic, just make sure that everything feels okay to you, nice and secure. Make sure that you've added in all of your gathers on the back, you've not got anything loose. And then the final thing to do is to hem our skirt. I've decided to overlock the bottom of my hem, and then I'm basically going to turn that up twice, make it look nice and neat, give it a quick press, and then sew that on my sewing machine. Okay, final touches of the project. I've got my blue thread loaded into my machine, and I'm just stitching the hem on my skirt. Well, I hope you've enjoyed seeing today's video and you've enjoyed learning all about how to make your own DIY skirt at home with no pattern. My Labrador Bentley's just decided to join me for the end of the video. I am putting in a little bit of footage at the end of the video here of me wearing the skirt, so hopefully you get a bit more of an idea of fit and how it looks on me, etc. It was a really fun project to make, and I really enjoyed doing it, so I hope that you enjoy having a go at making your own skirt at home if you decide to give it a go. But if you have enjoyed watching today's video, I would love it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thank you to everyone, of course, who has subscribed already and who does visit my channel week after week to watch my different videos. I do try and put videos up on a Monday if I possibly can, family life depending, but if not, it tends to be on a Tuesday, but I do aim for Monday if at all possible. But thank you so much for being with me today. I've really enjoyed it, so hopefully you have as well, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.